Hello, everybody. This is your host, Royce, Redneck Radio Man, joining you back again after break. And give me just a second here, and I'll get the next guest on the line. I didn't want to interfere with the break time music getting them, so I'll do it now.
Hello?
Hello, Bishop Jonathan?
Hello, Royce.
Yes, this is Royce, and by the way, just to let you know, we're already live on the air.
Lovely.
Okay.
Good to speak with you.
It's good to speak to you and to meet you finally, in person, so to speak.
Yes, and your listeners too. Hello to everyone that's listening.
Okay. Now, we're going to talk about your book, that old devil called God Again.
Yes.
So, real quick, why don't you let everybody know a little something about yourself before we start, and what, caused you to want to write about this particular subject, in other words?
Well, I'm 58. I've been involved in, I suppose, religious ministry since I was 24 when I was first ordained. So I've had a lifetime in pastoral and ministerial work. And at the end, or within that experience, I wanted to reflect upon, I suppose, the abuses that religion has occasioned, and to try and warn people of how to find a safe pathway through the mysterious things of life so that they can engage positively and productively with the world in which they find themselves.
Okay. Well, I know that I've had quite a bit of experience in the church myself, not in the same way you have. I don't know, I've gotten to a point now to where I'm pro-God but anti-religion.
Yes, well, I think that's a good divide, to be anti-religion. I think the first part, the pro-God, needs a little bit of work as well, because behind that sound bite, which is G-O-D, God, in our language, in other languages it's another sort of formulation of sound, lies, I suppose, a million little devils. And it can sometimes cause pain, trauma, fracture to life. And at its best, it can create assistance, strength, and liberation. My concern is that it causes the liberation, not the fracture.
Right. And I guess a good place to start right now would be for you to give us a little better definition of the term God.
Well, therein lies the enigma that faces the world, because the fact is we have no facts about God. We have imagination and speculation.
And what we've been taught.
Yes. And the sort of the receptive nature of a child absorbing all information that's provided for them means that they take on board the language, the concepts, the dogmas, the assumptions, the prejudices of the adult world around them. And part of the book is to try and alert people to the fact that they are entirely preconditioned as people to have a particular form of language, a particular perception, which entirely colours their understanding of that soundbite, the word God. And so to begin afresh as an adult to try and reevaluate what that soundbite means is so difficult. You have to strip yourself down to utter nakedness and vulnerability and begin again. And part of that is to realize we know nothing. There are no facts about God. We start from a place of complete ignorance and lack of knowledge.
I think that'd be the best place to start.
Exactly. And
now,
from that...
sorry to interrupt you. I thought I'd let you know that you got a caller on the line. Caller, you're on the air.
Hello.
Hello. Oh, is that you said hello, John?
Yeah, I was saying hello. Is this a caller into your station?
Well, yeah, he just called and I added him to the call, but he's not saying anything. Caller area code 806, you're live. Well, he doesn't appear to be speaking for whatever reason.
Right, okay. Perhaps it's a soundbite, no.
I don't know, but he can always, I guess, call back if he wants to try to talk to you. I just went ahead and cleared the line just so it didn't get confusing later on, in other words.
Yes.
Okay, so coming back to where we were at now, you were talking about if you want to learn more about God, a great place to start would be to first realize how little you really know, which I think personally is a great place because you're getting rid of all the misconceptions that you've been taught as a child, in other words.
Yes, you start with a blank screen, and then in my book I suggest that we then begin to project up onto the screen our ideas and our perceptions up to the community for reaction, for review, for critique. And so many of the images that people project onto that blank screen are very horrific and worrying. So to find pure images that somehow find purchase in a good and moral engagement and understanding of life is, I think, they're few and hard to find. But that's the challenge, and I think it's a constantly changing set of images to try and reflect our understanding of mystery. But I think one has to go back behind that as well and to ask the question, well, why are we trying to project an image out of ignorance? What is it about the human condition that requires something visual, something visible and tangible upon which to build a belief system? Why do we need that? Why can't we just stand on the chasm and look beyond into the unknown and be comfortable with that?
I think that's really a real hard thing for most people to do. I mean, because reality is such a tangible thing. If you ask me, it makes it hard to trust anything other than what you perceive as reality.
I think that the modern developments in the understanding of the way we think, feel, hear, see, the way our brain works, leads us to have a fragility of tenure about that which we think we know. People see things and people hear things, and then we suddenly realize, actually, we haven't heard them or seen them. Our brain has superimposed an image. It's superimposed or scrambled from a series of sounds, a particular sentence. It's almost like predictive texting. The brain gives us information that, in fact, isn't there. It's fantasy information or stored data that it just projects up onto the present moment. So the things that people claim, oh, this happened to me, and it's upon that experience that I've changed my life, when you begin to put a spotlight on it, they may be building their life on a fabrication, and that's very worrying. It may not be worrying if it leads to productive and good things, but if the basis of it is a fantasy, they've got to reevaluate that at some point and to build a moral framework upon which they wish to continue their choices in life.
Well, let me ask you this here. What was it that brought you to the point that you finally realized that you weren't finding God inside of religion and you needed to look elsewhere? I mean, for years you were, an active part of the church, and then all of a sudden it seemed like you got this here wake-up call that says, wait a minute, things are not what they seem to be. How did you get to that point?
Well, I've traveled widely. I've met people from many different cultures. I've talked with people and had friendships with people of many different faiths. I've been to the edge of many emotional experiences. And I think when you delve deep laterally, you gain a deep respect for human beings and the commonality between them. And you, if you're a thinking person, have to ask penetrating questions that push the boundaries and particularly burst open the boxes into which we're placed both by our background and our culture and our present circumstances. So you get a full, panoramic, comprehensive perspective of the world and of thought. So I think it was in doing that bit by bit, I began to fly above what seemed to be the petty trivialities of the moment, the transitory thoughts that I'd been given and the circumstances in which I'd been placed, to see a much wider view. And the little God and the little language that's used about God was no longer useful. In fact, it seemed to be almost offensive. And many of the doctrines that once seemed to be innocent and sweet became actually cruel and exclusive. And one gained a sense that there had to be a language or an understanding of spirituality that was much broader, wider, inclusive, comprehensive, and engaging for everyone, and that incorporated everyone if it was to be of use for the international community. And if not, it had to be binned.
So a lot of what helped you along the way was the fact that you just naturally had an open mind.
I think I did have an open mind, although I have to say that on the journey that I took into spirituality, I went into various boxes which were pretty closed and exclusive. So I travelled into those zones where you began to think that one had the truth and others didn't, and one had a message to give that they needed to learn from. But all those transitory places of exclusion and exclusivity became frustrating because they were inadequate. So one travelled on beyond them. I think many people's spiritual journeys are like that. Not actually only in religious terms, but people often go from rigidity in thought to a greater liberality of thought as they take on more information. And that's the benefit and the joy of education. Education opens you up to not just very linear lines of understanding, but the multi-threaded world in which we live and the challenges that come from all sorts of quarters that one has to take on board if you're going to have a holistic understanding of life.
That's interesting. You just gave me an idea. I mean, a new perspective, you might say, because I was sitting here listening to you, and I got to thinking when you said the word finite, that if you stop and think about it, most of your religious teaching would be a finite teaching, where most of your spirituality teaching would be an infinite teaching.
Yes, I like that essential contradiction. And that's the strange thing, that one talks about the all-knowing, all-powerful, all-wise deity, and one talks about that which is uncatchable and inexpressible in the deity and in divine understanding. But the minute one does that, you begin to create something apprehendable. And the minute that happens, you've betrayed the mystery, the enigma that one's trying to convey. And I think in certain spiritual traditions, one wasn't allowed. In fact, it was a grave penalty to seek to create an image of God. One finds that in the Old Testament passages, the first parts of the Bible. But of course, one can do that linguistically and doctrinally, as well as from stone and plaster. We cannot bring down God to puppet level, and yet most religions do that very thing.
They put him on a box and put rules on him and claim he's all-powerful, but yet he's under their rules so that the whole time he's all-powerful.
Well, the dangerous thing is that most of what we do with the invisible world of spirituality is to project onto it our own needs for supremacy and dominance and power. So most of the rules and the regulations, most of the authority structures and the concept of divine revelation, they're purely to bolster and to undergird a system of power mediated often or mainly through masculine authority lines and patriarchal authority lines, and in which there is housed power and advantage to the few and the puppetry of the many. So there's a great dishonesty in terms of the way that religion is played out in the world. And it's that sense that one wants to expose that if we're going to actually move forward from an international perspective to justice, peace and equality for all people.
Well, I was noticing in your book you covered a lot of tough subjects right there at the very beginning. Tough talks about God, tough talks about Jesus, tough talks about religion. Of course, the book's rather in-depth. It sure couldn't cover the whole thing in a 1-hour show. But I was wondering if you would like to kind of give us a quick overview of those, some of those tough talks.
The tough talks. Well, I think, again, if one has that concept of that empty screen and what's projected onto it, often, if you look at the projections, the films we run in our minds, we find that they're, in a sense, produced by our filmmakers, as it were, from Hollywood or wherever. And the facts that lie behind it don't lead to those images. So people have a sweet image of the Bible as a wonderful book that you can give to children and that will bring them life and in which you'll find inspiration, wisdom and grace. If you actually read the Bible, it's full of the most vile, genocidal, brutal happenings that are shocking stories that should be adult-rated and should never fall into the hands of children.
You mean like where God instructed Israelites to keep some of the virgins from the other tribes they were running over for their own services, in other words, kind of like condoning rape?
Yes, absolutely. the unjust regulations, the discrimination against those of other races, the discrimination against women, the discrimination against the disabled. I mean, and the hierarchical nature of authority, whereby slaves were treated in the most appalling, heinous manner. You can't read it without actually shivering. And yet I think most people actually haven't read it. Or they've read it and they've become anesthetized through the sort of Hollywood filmology to realize what they're reading. People can read, for instance, the story of Abraham being willing to plunge a knife into his beautiful son as a gift to God, an act of great faith and deep spiritual loyalty. And they can read it in church and say, this is the word of the Lord, without realizing that they've read actually the most barbaric, abusive passage that could possibly have been read. Because what parent would be willing to murder their own child out of their faith? Well, around the world, we're seeing suicide bombers doing that very same thing. And on the one hand, we are breathless in horror when that takes place and a suicide child is blown up. But then we're actually in our churches reading the story about Abraham and Isaac, doing the very self-same thing, but because it's part of our religious narrative, we're saying, oh, this is beautiful, this is God's word. It's a complete disjunct. It's a contradiction, it's a conundrum, and it's something that needs to chill us into realizing that we don't realize the games that have been played with us, the conditioning that is at play within us, to make it hard for us to look honestly and with logical analysis at the events of the world and our own lives.
Well, I'll be honest with you, from what I've noticed, it seems like most people will go to church and they'll listen to what the pastor says and take that to be the total gospel, and mainly because the pastor sits there in front of the whole congregation, open the Bible, and actually read the verse word for word, but then he'll proceed to carry the whole thing out of context and give it a whole new meaning with the words he does following the reading of it. And most people, they don't want to take their Bibles home and read it, so they just take their Bible to church and open it up, read the verse with the pastor, that Bible is opened again till the next Sunday, and what they're actually getting out of that is not what the Bible says, but what the actual pastor says.
I think you're absolutely right, Royce, and I think it indicates that what's at work is our psychological needs within us that actually have got nothing to do with God or spirituality, nothing to do with penetrating the mystery of that which is beyond, but have got to do with the raw infantile need within us to basically sit down with mummy and daddy at night time and have a story read to us and to feel nostalgic and sweet and peaceful so that we can tumble into the beauty of sleep or quiet life in a safe manner. It's a replay of the sort of receptivity we had in childhood to take milk from our mums and goodness from the parents and teachers around us. And we need to grow up from all of that, because that's not what's at play. We can't listen to what a pastor says. We can't have him dissemble and to change black to white, to take a dreadful scripture and present it to the sweet one, to make this awesome mystery of God into a little teddy bear we can take home and cuddle and have as our possession. All of that's to betray the reality that's at play within our adult engagements within the world. And of course it leads to the sorts of abuses, both in terms of power, government, sexuality, and economically, that have basically riven dreadful things around us and throughout history. One's got to grow up. And it seems to me that spirituality and our approach to religion is a major, major player in both stopping us at present growing up and enabling us to, if we get it right, in the future.
Well, let me ask you this here. Do you still preach in your own church on Sundays?
I don't like the word preaching. I really don't. I don't like the concept of sermons, because it seems to me they're propaganda tools where ignorance...
Another word for brainwashing?
It is brainwashing, and it is the spreading of ignorance. It's the covering over of modern knowledge, of scientific insight, or it's the taking of scientific insight and the contorting it into a false justifying of biblical text or particular dogma. There's a mangling that's taking place of logical thinking, and the congregation are not aware of it, or they may be aware of it but complicit with it. So I also don't like it because I think the concept of rousing preaching, rousing public speaking, of course, has been used by dictators across the world to do the most dreadful things. So right. I think attention to detail, the sort of cold analysis in the cool light of day, attention to reading, to text, to the analysis of text, the sort of thing that lawyers painstakingly do when they pull apart a particular phrase. I think we have to do that. We have to have a scientific, empirical approach to life where we look at things in great detail and we seek to understand them in their absolute depth and to realize what we don't know and what we do know and to build choice upon that which we do and with the respect for that which we don't, but not to be swayed by the sort of emotional rantings and the ignorant presentations of preachers.
Well, from my way of thinking, to be totally honest, when a person goes to church and takes in every word a Sunday school teacher or a pastor says to be reality, the gospel truth, the way of life, what they've actually done, whether they're aware of it or not, is they've given their power over themselves and their beliefs to the person who is speaking at the time.
Yes, I think that's absolutely true. And I think the whole commodification of human beings is part of the capitalist and modern agenda. We don't realize it because we think we become ever freer. And in one sense, we do, because we believe we have a series of choices. And sometimes free-spirited people are willing to fly beyond the prescribed offering of choice and to discover new worlds beyond. But most of the time, through advertising, through those who have the power to disseminate knowledge of product or commodity, we become branded. We become religiously branded and fashion branded, and in terms of the films we know about or the music we listen to. We don't realize that we are still slaves and pawns to those who hold the reins of power. And people, of course, are held religiously in that same sort of servitude. So the path to liberation, where you can re-own your birthright to be an independent person upon this earth and to seek to engage creatively and with justice with other free human beings, it's a fraught and a difficult path. And to be able to do it, one has to throw off the shackles that are being put on us all the time. It's a hard thing to do, and my book is an attempt to try and alert people and encourage them to do it.
Right, which I think is very good that you do that, and there's others that are doing it too. Yes. I mean, because let's face it, if nobody tried to alert anybody, then how's anybody ever going to find out, hey, I've been duped? You need people like you to stand up and say something and point it out, in other words.
I think it's so hard, though, because I know this will sound strange, but I think people almost want to be duped. They don't want to question too much, because there are some people who perhaps are born as idealists or born to press at the sides and the boundaries, and there are other people who just want to be in the sort of the center of the group, almost like they don't want to be the penguins on the outside. They want to have the warmth on the inside, even though in penguin life it is rotational, I think. But I don't think it happens like that in human communities. So to get people to be brave enough to say, no, I want to challenge the status quo. I want to stand up and react to what the preacher has said this morning. I don't want to accept this doctrine. I don't want to go to the local school and find a nativity play on without standing up and saying, why is this happening? Why are we making this fuss about Jesus? Aren't there so many other babies that are important in the world? Aren't we actually perpetuating in our children terrible things by having nativity plays at Christmas in schools and in churches, etc.? It's questioning what's happening. People don't want to do that. And we think we're becoming released to be free in a multi-choice world, whereas in fact macro culture is taking over, and there are very clear international brands that are perpetuating to their own advantage our loyalty and our support, and we are being, in a way, confined into channels of response which have to be challenged, because the end of that process is a dismal one.
Very dismal. I mean, it's like people become roboticized over a period of time, and then it's all just the same old life. Get up, go to work, get up, go to church, get up, come home. Everybody believes one certain thing. There's no variety. It becomes a very gray world over a period of time.
The strange thing is, I think if you look at animal behavior, and if human beings, are walking along and they look at cows in the field or sheep munching on the grass or even their pets at home, they sometimes think, gosh, must be quite boring to do the same repetitive pattern day in, day out. Where's the satisfaction in that? Without realizing that if they actually took an overview of their own lives and choices, they're doing exactly the
same thing. And it's interesting, you should compare it to an animal, because we all have an ego, which is really, in its basic sense, animalistic, like in nature.
Well, at the end of the day, we are all animals. And the way so much of us responds, which we haven't realized before, is instinctive, is programmed. We think we're making choices, but we're not. Daniel Kahneman's book is very, very surprising and telling about that we are, I suppose, in receipt of the way evolution has programmed us to stimuli and has given us a brain which can only produce information and process things in a particular way. And I think when we actually research that and realize that, it came as a great shock to me through reading, when I suddenly realized that things I could see sometimes, you see some, for instance, your listeners will have this, they are walking along and they see something out of the corner of their eye, and they haven't seen it, they've seen something, and their brain actually gives them an image. It might be something leaping. I say this in my book. It might be like a cat leaping or a dog moving, or it could be like somebody about to pounce on them. And they turn around and it's nothing of the sort. It's a tree that's swaying in the wind or something. But what they actually saw before they corrected the image was something their brain had given them. Well, we're only just beginning to understand the power of the brain to actually be in charge of the way we engage with the world. And that's quite a worry for us, because we suddenly begin to think, oh gosh, we thought we had it all wrapped up, but perhaps we haven't. We thought we understood this, but perhaps we don't. And in a way that takes us out of our comfort zone. We can be awed by that and frightened and, in a sense, be crushed by the opportunity within it, or we can be excited by it and go forward across the boundaries as people have done in the past, to discover whole new worlds that lie beyond it. And I think that's where religion comes in, that religion can sort of put boundaries and say, oh no, you mustn't, and you can't, and don't, and God wouldn't want. When in fact, we want an opposite message to that, a sort of a wider meta-narrative which says, yes, you must cross the boundaries. You must realize that the people living in other lands and the thoughts in other zones are there to be explored and woven together so that our whole international understanding can advance. Nothing must limit that. As space, in a sense, has no frontier, human thought must have no frontier either, nor experience.
Right. Now, real quick, I want to mention your website. It's www.bishopjonathanblake.com, and I have put that in the chat room for you folks. And you can learn more about him as well as his books at that website. And he does have contact info there, because that's how I got a hold of him.
Yeah, I'd be very welcome. Very glad if anybody who wants to get in contact with me. I enjoy contacts, networking, and conversations.
Yeah, I can gather that much. And, you're a very open person. And, I really do believe you are trying to help. You've seen a lot in your life. You've traveled quite a bit. And, you've tried to help the underdog, according to your book, in more than one situation, in other words.
Well, the thing that worries me is that whenever... And again, this goes back to the question you asked earlier on, is that if I feel comfortable, the minute I feel comfortable, the first thought that comes to me is, what about those who aren't comfortable? The minute I feel I belong to a group, the first thought that comes to me is, but what about those who don't belong? What about the people who are outside on the pavement, or who are outside this dogmatic set of understanding, or who have a different political framework? Because it's the people outside you have to be concerned about. It's no good just being cozy on the inside. So that means that every human being, to me, has to matter, has to be of equal value, that we all have our place upon this planet Earth, and we must all have our place in the philosophical, cultural, religious understanding of this planet Earth. And if there isn't a vehicle that can accommodate that, then the vehicle needs to be changed. And I think most of the religious narratives that are at play on the earth at the moment are so narrow, so restrictive, so boundaried, that the idea of a wall-less belief that would unite everybody isn't there. And the United Nations, in a sense, flags it up as a political hope. Obviously, it's not actually executive backed yet. It doesn't have the power that it should have. But it gives us a sort of a political image. But we haven't got something similar religiously, to have something which is pan-world, which involves everybody, a story that everybody can buy into. And perhaps that needs to be a secular story. It needs to be something which holds our symbols, our concepts of what has value and what's important, and that we can celebrate together, which isn't based upon narrow religious stories that have arisen in historical times. That we
get away from dogmatics and into the inner workings.
Yeah, and the inner workings are common to everybody. You know, you meet somebody, if you meet a human being from wherever they come from and get to know them, the way they tick, what they long for and aspire for, is common to all humanity. They can have been mangled and hurt and damaged along the way, but at root, there are those common threads to be woven and to be built upon. We need to stop damaging each other and alienating one another and start to dance together.
Well, it seems to me from what I've noticed that most of this dogmatic teaching and that all goes back to one of the Abrahamic faiths. Most of the other, like pagan and Wicca and some of those, they don't do that. They're more open to different people in different ways, in other words.
Well, I agree with that there's a greater elasticity, a greater accommodation of the strange, of the alien, the outsider, and often a greater gentleness in other persuasions. But the strange thing about human identity is that because I think humans are vulnerable, because part of the evolutionary patterning is that it is by gathering together into a group that the group has got a greater potential to survive than the individual. That the requirement to create a walled experience, a community identity which can then sort of withstand the pressures and the attacks from outsiders, is built into our application of everything. So we happen upon an idea, whether it's a soft idea, as you've mentioned, paganism or Wiccanism or whatever. We can come to something which could be transacted in a gentle way among many people, but people possess it and they begin to communicate it as though it's the only way to approach something, and to be suspicious of other people who would approach things differently or who want to throw in their ideas. No, it's got to be done this way, and this is the ritual, this is the tradition, this is the festival we celebrate, these are the form of words you have to use. Oh no, we don't do that, but we do this. And that particularity of engagement very quickly alienates. You've got to have something which is continually able to take on board new generations, new ideas, new questions, new thought processes, new pieces of information, to have the flexibility, the pliability within it to grow and evolve, because evolution is constantly adapting and changing. So much religious thinking and so much cultural practices. And we know that humans just get stuck in the mud so often and frightened to move. We've got to be a moving people to carry on to what lies ahead.
Yeah, I have noticed monotheism is definitely stagnating, I guess would be the good word to use.
I think it's so stagnant, and there are sort of flurries of novelty where people adopt new musical forms, sometimes new lingual forms, new patterns of worship, and they say, oh gosh, we've modernized this. But what they don't realize is they're stuck with something that's museum age culture. You know, people talk about, for instance, in the Christian tradition, a modern God, and they sing these wonderful gospel songs with guitars and drums, but they're talking about God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit. It's nonsensical language. It's male-dominated. It's exclusive and offensive. It's got as much sort of pliability and movement in it as a lump of granite. So you suggest that, no, well, let's find new language to talk about God. Let's talk about God as mother and father, God as son and daughter, or however we want. Let's play with the images But then instantly, people start to get nervous, and you're branded a heretic and cast out of the church. And no, we can't. These are Trinitarian formulas laid down in the year dot. Well, the minute you've got a millstone around your neck like that, you're not going to be travelling very far, and you're certainly not going to be flying in the slipstream of possibility. So there has to be a sea change approach within our religious traditions, and I'm afraid, being realistic, I think that's unlikely. So that's why I think the support for religion is hemorrhaging. People's espousal of institutionalized forms of Christianity and other religious persuasions is dropping, apart from the fundamentalist fanatical expressions of it. But in time, I think the world will evolve out of religious adherence, and a new story will be needed, a new secular form of celebrating birth and giving and life and cycles of life will have to be found, and will need to come of age into a whole new post-religious way of operating.
I know that I personally know people who have broken away from the church. I don't mean just a few. I'm being a radio show host. I get many people on my show that have broken away from God, and some of them that have not. And I can see where you're coming from on that. It just seems like, though, for every one that breaks away and tries a new path, 2 or 3 more join the old path, in other words.
Well, I think that's true. Statistically, I do think religious adherence is in decline in the modern educated world. I don't think it is growing factually, although there can be very noisy and sometimes politically powerful or pressure group powerful expressions of particular fundamentalist forms of religion. But one thing I'd want to say as well is that this sense of standing on the mountaintop and looking into unknowns beyond does hold, I think, an important approach to the world, which mustn't be lost as well, that one can become secularized, one can give up old forms of believing and petty ideas of God and stand in a brave new position looking for a secular narrative. But I do think there has to be things like a humility built into one's believing that prevents arrogance, prevents superiority, that keeps us aware that while we know all that we know, there is a vast amount and far more still that we don't know, and what we'll find in that is unknown. And in a way, one can't be fanatical and fundamentalist and dogmatic in rejecting mystery, as one has been in embracing it, because we might find things in the future which will be shocking and which will completely unwrap everything that we've perceived so far. So I think there has to be the balance between pursuing knowledge respectfully and also being aware with humility of that which we don't know, and travelling with that speculative, that questioning, that uncertain and longing human desire to journey forward with an open mind and an open heart to enjoy all that lies ahead.
Yeah. I know that you was talking about those nativity scenes earlier.
Yes.
And it reminded me of a sermon. I know you don't like that word, but this is what Fred Price called it anyway. But he was telling everybody that those nativities are not even biblical. They're not even scriptural. He actually showed everybody in the Bible, for example, that the Bible never said there was 3 wise men. It just said there were wise men. Yet every nativity scene has 3 wise men. He talked about the fact that if you look at Luke and Matthew is really talking about Jesus as an older child, age 2, whereas Luke's talking about him, at his birth. So there's a lot of things that he's found in that nativity scene that just, didn't quite line up with Scripture if you paid attention to what you were reading. And, I say this because you was mentioning a minute ago about people finding things that are, shockingly true. That would qualify, I think, as something shockingly true if people were to find out that the nativity isn't scriptural. If they were to find out, for example, that Jesus wasn't even considered as God until the Council of Nicaea, I think under Constantine, up until then he was considered a prophet, people would find that pretty shocking also.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. And if people came to read the Bible carefully and realized that much of what they think about Jesus and believe about Jesus has been given to them by the church, by those that came after, who wrote and introduced into Scripture, into dogma, their own particular perceptions and their own ideas. And it was never there in the happening and the experiencing. Then their faith would be very different. Whether that happens, whether we, for instance, discover the grave of Jesus, or we uncover more information about his human frailty, but there are indicators still in the Bible about the fact that Jesus was just a human being, and upon him has been built the edifice of what we know to be the church. But I think again there's trickery involved, that we know what human beings are. We know how human beings come about. I think if you broach people and ask them to think clearly, then the sense that Mary was a virgin and God basically impregnated her is not something they could actually hold to. And if they did say, no, I absolutely believe that, and one said to them, well, then you're actually talking about child abuse, aren't you? You're talking about the grooming of a young, poor, innocent teenager by a horrific, monstrous, powerful being, like a king or a celebrity taking advantage of a minion. And you wouldn't countenance that, would you? Because it would be criminal in all countries, wouldn't it, of the world? And so you're looking at text and realizing that you're superimposing upon it a sort of fantastical, mythical way of believing. And the facts either aren't there, or the facts are there, and one should be having a different response to them. I think the plastic Jesus that's preached in churches is so deeply offensive. And we get little catches, I mentioned this in my book, of the real Jesus, where he's being very prejudiced with the Syrophoenician woman and likening her to a dog. You think, gosh, what, Jesus was calling a woman a dog? I mean, surely that didn't take place. Well, it did. Read your Bible. And Jesus, being arrested by the police for criminal damage because of his violence, just wouldn't be violent. Well, he was violent in the temple. He whipped the money changers. If there was a religious preacher who went into a cathedral today and whipped the sellers in the little shops in the cathedral goodie places and overturned all the bookstands, they'd be in prison. But it's a whole disjointed approach that people need to wake up to get, in a sense, their religious house in order, their thinking in order. Because at the moment, everything's out of place and everything's being manipulated. And that does us all a disservice, because we can't then approach and interpret and work with the world in which we're living in a proper and adult way.
Yeah, that was one of the things about the New Testament, was how in one minute Jesus is a kind, loving philosopher and teacher, but then in other verses he got pretty downright mean. And the interesting thing was, the only thing people remember when you talk to him on the street was the kind philosopher, and nobody ever remembers reading a word about, the other negative things he did, in other words.
Yes, but the negative things are just overlooked.
Right, that's what I'm saying.
As you said earlier on, they are glossed. They're given a sweet edge when there isn't a sweet edge to them, but the preacher presents them as such. But there's a trickery involved, because the central belief that Jesus died upon the cross, that basically the gospel goes like this, that God the Father so loved the world that he sent his own son to basically die upon the cross for our salvation. Now, if you unpack that, this is parental abuse, this is child abuse. This goes back to Abraham and Isaac, but it's there in the central belief of the Christian faith, that God would send his son to die. Well, this is what the suicide bombers are doing across the world. None of us countenance it. It's horrific. But it's the basis of the Christian faith. So one has to say that, no, Jesus didn't die for us. It was a great mistake that took place. The crucifixion should never have happened. Jesus should have had the grace, the wherewithal, and the wisdom to stop what often happens in religious traditions, that people choose violence and choose martyrdom out of some sort of religious expression of devotion, he should have withstood that and said, no, I'm not going to be crucified. I'm not going to play those games, because life is intrinsically valuable. It's sacred that I can walk upon the earth. And I must put a stop to this tradition of inherent violence within religious believing. And that was quite open to him, because when he was being questioned by the authorities, it was almost as though Pontius Pilate and the others were begging him to give them the answers they wanted. But he was, as it's written in the scriptures, sort of playing games, ducking and diving, almost deliberately putting himself into a position whereby he would be crucified, because that was the martyr tradition. So if one says, no, Jesus actually made a mistake there, and the concept that God would ever want Jesus to die upon the cross is so distorted, we have to get rid of that, then you can look at the Christian faith and completely represent it, completely reinterpret it, have different canticles, different psalms, different songs, different prayers that would arise from it. It would undergird a much more respectful engagement with the world, where life was cherished, where people wouldn't be blowing themselves up or blowing other people up and dying in the pursuit of their faith, because that would have been seen to be an old and wrong style of religious activity. But there needs to be a courage to do that. And I'm afraid the churches and the leaders of churches and other religions are certainly not up to that challenge at the moment.
I would tend to agree with that, and I'm not too certain they're going to be up to it anytime in the near future either. But yeah, I was going to mention, we've got about roughly maybe 8 to 10 minutes left, and I wanted to make sure before we ran out of time that there's anything you wanted to say or cover, you had a chance to do it. So why don't you right now, if you've got anything out there that I haven't talked to help you cover, throw it out on the table for everybody to hear.
I think what I want to put out on the table is, it seems to me we all face a challenge, which is if we can climb out of the boxes that we've been placed in from childhood, if we can get rid of all the images that are projected onto this religious screen that we've got and have it blank, if we're all brave enough to go, and I say in the book we could go, just make that the M noise with our mouths, our lips, we don't know. We haven't got answers. We haven't got doctrines. We haven't got dogmas. We're not going to go down the line of getting on our knees in prayer, asking for something. We're going to actually grow up and look at the world as it is, and look at our lives and our possibilities, and develop together a story which expresses love and justice and goodness and truth, high moral principle, the desire to be working together so we are able to share economically our resources, not to plunder and rape the earth, to build together community where together we're healthy, together we're educated, not to run ahead of one person so another person is left in the gutter. What's the story that could give birth to that and sustain that? What's the festivals that we could celebrate together that would unite everybody? Not a nativity story looking and gazing at Jesus again and again. Not Easter where we're looking up at the cross and thinking about Jesus' suffering all those years ago. No. Looking at the suffering of people today. Looking at the birth of people today. Looking at how we can make the birth of everybody possible into an equal world with equal advantage and opportunity, looking at the suffering of the people across the world who are suffering and trying to find out the causes and alleviate them and overcome them. What's the story and the narrative that can give birth to that? And what are the things that are obstructive of that and resistant to that? And if together we can come up with something that answers that and start to build that through the United Nations or whatever, then it seems to me that there's hope. And that's a deep moral, spiritual, practical quest that all of us can buy into and be a part of, because it excludes no one. It's not based on any particular prejudice or assumption, not based on any metaphysical truth. It's based on the reality of our human condition, that we are all human beings, we inhabit planet Earth, and we've got to live well together and make sure that Earth is passed on well to the children and those that follow us. So I would love people to get involved in that sort of international discussion and to come up with ideas and produce something together.
Yeah, I think I would tend to agree with you on that one. I mean, because the way things are going right now, the future doesn't look real promising if something don't change.
Well, at the moment, we're just splintering, it seems, into these harsh, fundamentalist lines of very bigoted and restrictive thinking, where we're pitted one against the other, nation against the other, culture, religion against the other. And it's that the old cycles in repetitive and endless motion, and it seems there are the spring buds of hope every so often around the world, but they need to come together and garner support. There needs to be a new way forward, and I think, in a way, the dusty, tired paths that are so well travelled of the past have got to be deviated from and new paths found. And there has to be a courage to do that, and perhaps it'll be the younger generation that leads us into that. But I think there has to be the older generation too that are standing there cheering and pitching in their wisdom and 2 cents worth as well. But conversations like this and books, my book and other people's books, other initiatives that you've referred to, all of that is part of perhaps a groundswell of hope that a new world is coming. Perhaps we won't live to see it, but let's hope it's part of evolution's gifts to the world.
I tend to agree with you. It's going to have to start with the children and the children's parents. I mean, right now, it's the parents, especially the ones in the churches, that are teaching their children to be racist, or that whites are supreme, or any other people are supreme. That's teaching all the bigotry. And in many cases, they're really just trying to raise the children to be good moral people, and they don't even realize what the end product of their teaching is. I'm not saying people do it on purpose, but the thing is, until people wake up and realize what the end effect is of their teaching, then we can't really hope for a change till they do.
I think what you've said is important there, Royce, because I think people do innocently make a choice that they will teach their children religious truths, they will take them to church or places of worship because they want them to be good. And it's as though it's only those places that are the resource points for goodness to be grown and encouraged. And the myth about that is, of course, in exposing children to those sorts of dogmas, they learn about the sorts of prejudices that says that they have the truth, that their God is the only God, that they've got to proselytize and convert other people into their way of thinking and believing. And suddenly the world is perpetuated in its fragmentation. So the very thing they're trying to achieve, they're undermining. But the question, and this is the thing that worries me, is that if you're a good parent, if you're a good person, if you've got a good heart and you want to build a good world, and you say, and you see that religious communities are counterproductive to that end, then where else do you go? And it seems to me that there's not at the moment a replacement resource, that there's the body politic, the general common mass of people. Many of them are going about their own lives and trying to do good, but they haven't somehow pooled that resource into a cohesive force to produce some form of story or narrative or tradition that can energize them to pursue good and to find and to identify good and to be able to educate and pass that on to their children. And the secular agenda is obviously being played out in different nations at the moment, and that's overcoming religious prejudice, but it doesn't at its heart, it seems to me, have the momentum, the sort of spiritual dance, the music within it, to capture the imagination of the children and to engage them to a path of goodness and community involvement. And it's that's missing. And I'm not sure what's going to create that or produce that, but something has to.
Whoops. That tune was just letting us know we just ran out of time. Once again, everybody, if y'all want to learn more about him, y'all can always go to his website, www.bishopjonathanblake.com, and he's got links to his books, and there's other stuff on there as well as how you can communicate with him. Don't forget that Revolution Radio and Talk Now Radio are both listener-supported, and you are what helps to keep us censorship-free, since, they can't say, well, we're not going to, advertise or sell you advertising money anymore unless you stop talking about, they can't do that if we're listener-supported. So don't forget to support us if you think we're doing a good service. And, Jonathan, I want to thank you for coming on the air, and I'd love to have you back again in the future.
Thank you, Ryan. It's been lovely to share this time with you and the listeners. Thank you.
Thank you. You have a good one.
Thank you for listening to Revolution
Bye-bye.
Radio.
Bye-bye.